page 7. Thanks for joining us on the Gallery TV newspaper review this morning. I am Titilayo Olamide. This morning, the major stories with me this morning is the Punch newspaper, the Daily Sun, the Nigeria Tribune, the Nation, and of course I have the Guardian, and lastly the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. But first, I go with the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper this morning, the major news headline says electronic result transmission. Says Southern senators turn against governors, National Assembly members clash. Senators says National Assembly NCC to determine when electronic transmission is feasible. And the decision of the APC-led Senate shocking. It undermines our electoral process, and that is coming from PDP. And this stories can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move to the upper part of the newspaper stories. It says COVID-19, World Bank mobilizes 100 billion US dollars support for Nigeria orders. World Bank mobilizes 100 billion US dollars support for fund for Nigeria others, and that story can be found on page 25 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And still above, the major news headline says to accommodate fresh loans, federal government raises new borrowing limit to 6 trillion naira. To accommodate fresh loans, federal government raises new borrowing limit to 6 trillion naira. And that story can be found on page 20 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And the next story is on page 7. It says NAFDAC approved Russian vaccine beneficiaries may be barred from Europe. NAFDAC approved Russian vaccine beneficiaries may be barred from Europe, and that is coming from Virologist. You can turn into page 7 of the Punch newspaper to find more about that story also. And then I turn into page 11 of the Punch newspaper this morning. It says PIB passage deadlock. Reps suspend consideration indefinitely. You can turn into page 11 of the Punch newspaper to read more about that story also. And then I move to page 3 of the Punch newspaper. It says certificate forgery. It says FCC chairman kicks as CSO's demands resignation. FCC chairman kicks as CSO demands resignation, and that story can be found on page 3 of the Punch newspaper this morning. Still on page 3, it says Britain firm seeks Carlos Consent to take over case. Britain firm seeks Carlos Consent to take over case, and that can be found on page 3 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And still on the front page newspaper stories, still on the Punch newspaper also says Oyetola's aides at Aregbesola Group exchange words over APC membership register. Oyetola's aides at Aregbesola Group exchange words over APC membership register, and that can be found on page 19 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then let's turn into page 4. Amotekun raids Ondo nightclubs. Import 40 vehicles. Amotekun raids Ondo nightclubs and import 40 vehicles the same night, and that story can be found on page 4 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then on page 7, I have on Eid al-Kabir celebration. The federal government declares Tuesday and Wednesday as the public holiday towards the celebration of the forthcoming Salah. Still on the front page stories, 74-year-old NYSC anthem composer weeps as DG visits. 74-year-old NYSC anthem composer weeps as DG visits, and that story can be found on page 7 of the Punch newspaper this morning. Next story is on page 6 and 5. page 4 and 5. It says fake developer defrauds 100 prospective Lagos tenants of 500 million naira. Fake developer defrauds 100 prospective Lagos tenants of 500 million naira. You can turn into page 4 and 5 of the Punch this morning to read more on that story. And lastly on the Punch, and that's on page 19. It says APC suspends 11 Lai Mohammed's followers, stop offenders registration. APC suspends 11 Lai Mohammed's followers, stop offenders registration. You can turn into page 19 of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And with that, I move to the Daily Sun newspaper. On the Daily Sun newspaper, taking us to the major news headline, it says Senate whistle down provision on electronic result transmission. Senate whistle down provision on electronic result transmission. Approves usage only when NCC certificate adequate secures coverage. Approves usage only when NCC certifies adequate secure coverage. Okes Buhari's fresh $8.3 billion loan. Okes Buhari's fresh $8.3 billion loan. And this stories can be found on page 4 and 46 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And also above the major news headline, it says PIB protest rocks House of Reps over 30% host community fund. Protest rocked House of Reps over 30% host community fund. Said lawmakers insist on 5% step down reports. Lawmakers insist on 5% step down reports. And then Senate okays bill. And that stories can be found on page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then I move below the major news headline, and there we are having the report on COVID-19. It says 39 UNILAG staff students infected. 39 UNILAG staff students infected. NAFDAC approves 2 Korean, 1 Russian vaccines. NAFDAC approves 2 Korean, 1 Russian vaccines. And that story can be found on page 44 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. Down below it is on page 45. Page 45, APC suspends 11 Lai Mohammed loyalists for taking party to court. APC suspends 11 Lai Mohammed loyalists for taking party to court. You can turn into page 44 of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. And then I have news headline here also. It says I was blindfolded in flight from Kenya to Nigeria, Kanu tells lawyers. I was blindfolded in flight from Kenya to Nigeria, Kanu tells lawyer. Says he was intercepted at underground airport car park. He says he was intercepted at underground airport car park. And that story can be found on page 45 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Olusoya appointed MD CEO of GT Bank. Olusoya appointed MD CEO of GTB Bank, and that story can be found on page 2 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Federal government to unveil new policy on toll gates. Federal government to unveil new policy on toll gates. You can turn into page 44 of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on the new policy that the federal government is set to unveil towards the toll use of our toll gates. Lastly, on the Daily Sun newspaper this morning, Kalu sponsors bill for establishment of food bank to reduce hunger on unemployment. Kalu sponsors bill establishment of food bank to reduce hunger and unemployment. You can turn into page 44 of the Daily Sun newspaper to find more on that story also. And with that, I move to the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And on the major news headline, I have e-transmission of elections results. E-transmission of election results. Says Senate gives NCC NAS final say. Senate gives NCC NAS final say. Says reps in stormy section takes brief from INEC NCC today. We are against fabulous watching of section 52(3) of proposed act, and that is coming from the Senate spokesperson. Division beauty of democracy. Division is the beauty of democracy, and that is coming from Senate President. And lastly, APC senators preparing grounds for mass vote rigging. APC senators preparing grounds for mass vote rigging, and that is coming from the opposition party, which is the PDP. The stories can be found on page 2 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. Then I move above the major news headline, and that is coming from the Northern lawmakers. Says Northern lawmakers kick against zoning presidency to South. Northern lawmakers kick against presidency zoning to the South, and that can be found on page 29 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. Next read is on page 2. Says Rep steps down consideration of PI bill report. Rep steps down consideration of PI bill report. That can be found on page 2. And the next read is on page 29. Federal government begins deductions of budget support facility for states this month. Federal government begins deductions of budget support facilities for states this month. That can be found on page 29. Says next to review implementation strategy of NSAS recommendation. That is coming from the Vice President, Professor Yemi Oshibanjo. And that takes us below. The Kaduna closes school for 3 weeks. Kaduna closes schools for 3 weeks, and that can be found on page 29 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then I turn into page 8. Says no government is subordinate to the other. No government is subordinate to the other. Agitations are effects of insecurity. The agitation for a separate nation is as a result of the insecurity in the nation, in the country, and that is coming from the NBA president. You can turn into page 8 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper to read more on the story and why he has said no government is a subordinate to the other. Next read is on page 7. It says Odua's Investments declares 5.2 billion naira profits invest in oil and gas. Odua Investments declares 5.2 billion naira profits invest in oil gas, and that can be found on page 7 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. Then I move below the major news headline, and that's on page 7. It says Senate approves Buhari's request for $8.325 million €490 million external loan. Senate approves Buhari's request for $8.325 million €490 million external loans, and that can be found on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. Next read is on page 3. Says no housing crisis in Nigeria. No housing crisis in Nigeria, and that is coming from the Minister of Works Empire in person of Babatunde Raji Fashola. And you can turn into page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper to find more in that. And then I move to page 5. Says NAFDAC approves more vaccines for COVID-19. NAFDAC approves more vaccines for COVID-19. Next read is on page 3. Governors have adjudged appointment of VCs for federal varsities. Federal government alleges governors have adjudged appointment of VCs for federal varsities. Federal government alleges, and that is on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And then I move to page 27. Journalist, policeman, 1 other killed in Ondo bank robbery. Journalist, policeman, one other killed in Ondo State's bank robbery, and that can be found on page 27 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Next read is on page 29. Kwara APC factions because as national chapter suspend 11 members. Kwara APC faction because as national chapter suspends 11 members. You can turn into page 29 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper to find more on that story. And then I move to the Nation newspaper. On the Nation newspaper this morning, on the major news headlines, is Senate dumps proposal on e-transmission of results. Senate dumps proposal on e-transmission of electoral results. Above the major news headline says 6/8/29 to Kano fighter jets depart US for Nigeria. 6/8/29 to Kano fighter jets depart US for Nigeria, and that can be found on page 4 of the Nation newspaper this morning. Next read is NAFDAC OK's Russian Spanish vaccines emergency use. NAFDAC OK's Russian Spanish vaccines emergency use. You can turn into page 5 of the Nation newspaper to read more on that. And next read is on page 5 also. Policeman, 2 other killed in Ondo bank robbery. Policeman, 2 others killed in Ondo bank robbery. And then lastly, on the above news headline, it says 60,000 unemployed youth registered with Lagos. 60,000 unemployed youth registered with Lagos. Still on the front page newspaper stories this morning, still on the Nation newspaper, on that is on PIB, says South leaders reject 3% for host communities. South leaders reject 3% for host community. Pandef INC protest. Pandef INC protest. And that stories can be found in the front page stories of the Nation newspaper this morning. With us, I move to the Guardian newspaper. Another major news headline says 2023 in jeopardy as Electoral Act amendment splits National Assembly. 2023 in jeopardy as Electoral Act amendments splits National Assembly. Moving above the major news headline, it says Federal government declares Wednesday, Tuesday as public holiday. Federal government declares Tuesday, Wednesday as public holiday in celebration of the festive period, the Starless festive period, and that can be found on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper. Still on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper, it says Nigeria must restructure or go separate ways. Yoruba groups tells North. Nigeria must restructure or go separate ways, and that is coming from Yoruba groups to the northern part of the country. Next to it is on page 5. Nigerians are starving. North Emir tells Buhari Nigerians are starving, and that is the Emir of Kano telling the President of Nigeria in person of Major General Muhammadu Buhari, and that can be found on page 5 of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then I move to page 8. Buhari approves 6.52 billion naira for ranching, unveils water road project in Katsina State. Buhari approves 6.52 billion naira for ranching, unveils water road projects in Katsina State, and that can be found on page 8. Lastly, above the news headlines, it says against South senators protest as Senate passes harmonized PIB. Against South senators protest as Senate passes harmonized PIB. That can be found on page 9 inside the Guardian newspaper this morning. Then I move below the major news headline. It says Senate approves Buhari's fresh $8.325 billion and 419 million euro loan. Federal government to suspend 47% of its 4-year revenue on debt servicing. Federal government to spend 47% of its 4-year revenue on debt servicing. And lastly, on the Guardian newspaper this morning, Ekiti resident doctor begins indefinite strike. Ekiti resident doctors begins indefinite strike. You can turn into page 7 of the Guardian newspaper this morning to find more on their story. And lastly, on today's newspaper review, we have the Daily Independent newspaper. And on the major news headline on Daily Independent newspaper, it says NAS in rowdy session over electronic transmission of results. NAS in rowdy section over electronic transmission of results. Senate empowers NCC to decide transmission of election results. Senate empowers NCC to decide transmission of election results. PDP Tambuwal says upper chamber's decision unconstitutional. PDP Tambuwal says upper chamber's decision unconstitutional, and that can be found on page 6 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And then I move above the major news headline. Secondos fights back as PDP governors move to dissolve NWC. Secondos fight back as PDP governors move to dissolve NWC. Its battle between Godfather is political godson. It's a battle between Godfather and its political godson. And the next to read is Senate okays Buhari's request for 8.325 million euro, US dollars, and 490 million euro external loans. Senate okays Buhari's request for 8.325 billion US dollars, 490 million euros external loans. Moving below the major news headline, says APC spares Lai Mohammed, suspends ministers 11 loyalists. APC spares Lai Mohammed, suspends ministers 11 loyalists, and that is on page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. Still on page 7, court issues criminal summons against Soludo over alleged perjury corruption. Court issues criminal summons against Soludo over alleged perjury and corruption. That's on page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper. And then I move to page 4. Nigeria's housing deficit not on the high side. Nigeria's housing deficit not on the high side, and that is coming from Fashola. You can turn into page 4 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to find more on that story. Federal government declares Tuesday, Wednesday holiday for Eid al-Kabir. Federal government declares Tuesday, Wednesday holidays for Eid al-Kabir, and that's on page 5. Rep steps down PIB after chaotic session. Rep steps down PIB after chaotic session. Niger Delta reps reject 3%, insist on 5% community fund. Amid protest, Senate passes PIB, retains 3% for host communities. And still on the front page stories of the Nigerian newspapers, and still on the Daily Independent newspaper, I have on COVID-19 reports. NAFDAC approves 3 additional vaccines for emergency use, and that's on page 4. And then on politics, that's on page 9. It says external forces not responsible for insecurity in Nigeria. External forces not responsible for insecurity in Nigeria, and that is coming from Ishaku. On page 5 on the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, Kano-Kaduna Railway to link major commercial cities to FCT. Kano-Kaduna Railway to link major commercial cities to FCT, and that is coming from Amechi. And lastly, on personal finance, that's on page 15 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, says how to manage your income wisely in a distressed economy, how to manage your income wisely in a distressed economy. You can turn into page 15 of the Daily Independent newspaper to find more about how you can manage your income in a distressed economy, especially this time in the country where the economy is so faulty. And with that, we've come to the end of the Gallery TV newspaper review. Don't forget to join us by 12 p.m. for yet some news updates. I remain Titilayo Olamide. Thanks for watching and do have a lovely day.